Thank you very much.
Hello.
It's very nice to be here and such a beautiful space. So we'll try and, I think the thing for us in this talk is just to enjoy it, really. This is what we've been saying to ourselves all day. I think the thing that's important to maybe start the conversation is that we work in an extremely busy, intense studio in London. We're working really across design and art direction. You could say in some forms of art practice that are emerging within the studio also. We work really across many, many disciplines. When people ask us what do we design, I mean, we design almost anything that one can design. And often we design simultaneous networks of various outputs within a set concept. And you could say there's a range of ideas that are emerging. Ultimately, it's a complex web of activity. And one of the things that you can see on the screen now is a kind of almost a mantra which we live by, which is the idea that design is a conversation. In that sense, it can be interpreted in many ways, but we're interested to work collaboratively with others. And in that sense, we explore our work live through those projects and commissions. And also, Oliver and I have been working together for a long time. I mean, OKRM was always designed as a practice with the idea that we would constantly be in conversation with one another.
So I guess something that's important for us to try and do today, I say try because it's quite complicated, for let's say designers or art directors to truly identify or communicate the consistent agenda within a body of work. We spend so much time working with and for others. It's just often hard to kind of like identify exactly what that is. Today, though, we're going to try and figure out what the red thread is of our practice, so something that's kind of common to all of the projects and certainly the projects that we're going to present today. And one of those things is it's about creating space, and this can be creating space through well, it could be a conceptual space, or it could be a physical space, like this one here, or the space of a book, so printed, also time-related. And often what we're trying to do when we're thinking about how we can create space in projects is how we define the hierarchy between things, or how we create contrast between one idea and another, or one artist and another artist. So it's really about, trying to create a clarity within a body of work.
Exactly. So what we'll start to do is we'll go through a sort of series of projects. I think we've got about sort of 3 case studies, and then by the time we're kind of walking through these ideas, we're likely to kind of dip into other forms of conversation that exist around those projects. So space. I mean, space is when you talk about designing spaces, the first thing that one thinks about is designing exhibition spaces. It's a classic format. Recently, we've been working with an institution that's based in Montreal called CCA. It was set up in 1976 by Phyllis Lambert, who's still alive. She's around 94 years old, and she's quite an amazing lady. She started the museum with this idea, and this is a quote of hers, that we are not a museum that puts things out and says, this is architecture, even though it's predominantly an architectural institute. But she says that we should try to make a conversation, in a way interrogate the possibility of the subjects that exist around architecture. And just to kind of prelude that it's important to kind of talk about is, for a long time we were approaching spatial design, and we were invited in as graphic designers. And there's a really horrible thing within institutions where they talk about a kind of 2D design and a 3D design. And for a long time, we were working out how to create a kind of holistic design. We often used to call this a kind of total design. And the thing about CCA is that the curator, Francesco Garuti, actually approached us knowing our body of work and knowing how we don't really stick to a discipline, let's say, of 2D design, but instead work across an entire concept. And I guess just to take you through a little bit of what he saw in our work and some of the projects that he referred to. The first of which was designing the surface, which we designed the Het Nooy Institute, the new institute in Rotterdam. It was an exhibition which dealt with all forms of different objects, but the surfaces and the finishes that exist on the outside of objects. But what's important to say about this is designing the surface was a perfect example of how we opened up a narrative layer which existed over the top of the whole exhibition. And we did that by creating the dialogue between various objects. And here you can see a kind of few examples of
just
that.
to say a little bit more about that, it was about creating a dialogue, but we actually worked with 2 writers to create 5 chapters, which were all scripted. So every time whichever pavilion you walked into, there was a script which you could kind of look at read whilst looking at all of the objects. And it just created this more dynamic exhibition experience.
Another specific aspect that Francesco was interested in our work was this idea of creating mood. And mood is a funny way of describing something which in a way is quite simple, which is the idea of how a space can make you feel. And there was a project and an exhibition in London called Fear and Love, which was the first exhibition at the Design Museum. And it dealt with the anxieties and the problems that existed within design and within the contemporary field. And it kind of started to talk about how, on one hand, fear, so the anxiety of fear, can like bring a certain positivity, and that was described with this word love. But what we really did in the exhibition Fear and Love, which you can see some images here, is we created an environment where we expressed this mood through a series of different materials.
The third kind of mini case study before we enter into CCA is for the British Pavilion at Venice Biennale. It was an exhibition called Home Economics. And what we were interested in doing here, because the subject matter was fairly complex, was to blur the threshold between the exhibition and the outside of the exhibition. So in a sense, like, how do you prime an audience with a bit of content before they enter the actual space of the exhibition?
And you can kind of see at the top here, there's a series of works which we made with our collaborator Matthew Lavonci, where we created a series of everyday images. The exhibition was all about the home, a series of images which dealt with your quintessential understanding of the home, and at the same time backed those images up with polemic statements which dealt with the curatorial conceit. And like Ollie said, I think this is something which Francesco took interest in, and we have an interest in our practice, which is to not think of the space as necessarily only what exists within the institution or within the gallery, but also the space that exists in proximity, in a sense, holistically to any kind of threshold through digital medium or through the street in terms of posters, or how you may approach the beginning of your conversation or your understanding of what the exhibition is dealing with.
One last point on that as well is that what you see before you get to the exhibition, i.e. these images of the everyday, is obviously very different content to what you see when you get to the exhibition. Outside, you see this kind of interpretation of a complex curatorial concept. Inside, you engage with the actual curatorial concept. So there's that sense of creating 2 methods of describing the same thing, like clear spaces.
So just to then sort of focus in a little bit on Our Happy Life. So Our Happy Life subtitle is Architecture and Well-Being in the Age of Emotional Capitalism. And just to read a sort of brief explanation. So it's a narrative, a kind of anti-manual, which explores and interprets recent paradigms that are shaping our present perception of place, giving new identity to the materials of private space of our homes, reconceiving our working environments, and transforming development itself through the planning of our cities. The fact is, Our Happy Life is an incredibly complicated subject, and Francesco wanted us to be part of the beginning and the conceptual phase of identifying how can you make an exhibition based on this subject, which in a sense isn't really based around the tradition of a series of specific objects, but instead is a kind of concept or an idea.
I mean, in fact, most of the exhibits don't exist in a physical way. It's either data which comes off really ugly-looking pie charts and graphs, or it's Instagram posters, things which exist in the digital arena. And we were very, I guess the first question is, how do you make that visually stimulating? How do you communicate this in a way which is not deathly boring?
So I think the thing that's important to talk about here is that we were invited into that beginning phase. And some of these images of that kind of room, so at CCA, the beautiful thing is you have this kind of project room below the exhibition space. So it means you can kind of keep going up to this one-to-one physical space. but then you have a model which is 1 to 25 downstairs of that space where you can start to really develop ideas. And in all honesty, when we arrived in Montreal, we didn't know exactly what to prepare. We knew that we were going to have a kind of conceptual conversation, but we didn't know that they were going to be at such an early stage. So what we set about doing was to really start to develop a kind of synthesis between this kind of curatorial point and the communication of this idea. And I think a kind of hyper-simplified, obviously it was never this simple. It's very, very complicated to get to this idea. You're kind of imagining something like 2 to 3 days conversation between ourselves and the director and 2 curators. But what we felt compelled to do is to create a very specific space where there would be, it would be considered almost like a series of scenographies. You could say a kind of, we would call it almost a series of film sets or specific sets. And each room of the exhibition, and you can see that there's 3 rooms at the bottom which lead you through this kind of triple space at the top, would lead you through aspects of the idea based on specific scenographies. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of how we start to describe these scenographies. So in a way, what we're trying to do is to build a kind of problem, in a way a problem which we want to design into, but that's also useful to convey the complex matter. So you have this kind of media lab, which then starts to talk about the news and the information that would exist within this space. You have this kind of solarium that we were compelled to talk about Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey in this kind of almost relaxing zone. And then we have this kind of parkour along the top, which is really, we were thinking about it very much like these kind of predefined parkours that you might get, for instance, in an airport in a duty-free kind of scenario where they would really, or a shopping mall, or these kind of synthetic environments, and then leading out into this space, which would be a kind of photo studio. And in terms of the exhibition, that space of the photo studio would be where it would talk about where this kind of content of happiness is created, this kind of place of production. So
with that in mind, so we knew we wanted to create something which had a very mood-driven, theatrical presentation, and so we took the kind of analogy of the theatre set, where you obviously have the stage and what happens on it, and then you have what goes on around it. To us, that really started to I don't know, allude to this idea that there should be something which is narrated, so perhaps like a narrator's voice, and something else which is a little bit more functional, which relates directly to the things that are being exhibited.
Functional, but also in a sense experiential, something you can experience and you can enter and almost immerse yourself in. The thing with exhibitions, especially at CCA, is that you would expect to use the walls for displaying of material. But in this case, we wanted to dedicate all of the walls to purely the explanation of the subject. And then the room in the center of the room themselves is something more of a, maybe potentially a kind of abstract experience.
So the two voices that we were looking at were, so one, the narrator's voice, and so we described this as a shorthand critical voice that introduces the key ideas of the narrative. And the kind of main visual reference for that was this idea of film subtitles. In kind of stark contrast to that, a very dry kind of institutional voice, which we call the objective voice, which is a descriptive voice that explains each exhibit in detail. So again, it's trying to create like a contrast between two opposing tones of voice.
And what this kind of adds up to, in a way, is almost like a kind of brief for the curators to then work within, which is, I would say, fairly unusual. Usually what would happen is the curators would already have defined what they want to say exactly, and then the graphic designer would articulate that in a particular distinctive or potentially undistinctive voice. So it's important to kind of, I don't know, give you a bit of an insight into the kind of level of abstraction that we're kind of working within, because it's fairly devoid of clarity, this kind of process. Yeah, it really takes a lot of imagination.
It is abstraction, but actually I think when a curator engages with a designer from an early stage, and the curatorial concept and the design concept are completely merged as one, it yields something which is not possible if that's kind of collaborative stage is missed out. at the beginning.
Yeah, like we call that a kind of synthesis, which is useful. I think what we're looking at here is really like some of those early attempts to try and for us to try and make attempts of what this voice might be and how it might look. And we imagined this almost like a film and a series of subtitles, which would pick up on like key aspects of the curatorial idea, or the idea of the
But this is often how we work. So we don't just like necessarily hand over a concept to a curator, for example, but we'll actually have a try at defining a bit of a tone ourselves, and then once we've got like an overview of an idea, we'll hand that over.
And then alongside this, as we talked about with the home economics exhibition at the Venice Biennale, we were very interested also, and part of our commission was to consider a kind of campaign, so a level of communication which worked outside of the institution. In order to do that, we started to break down specific points of within the sort of, let's say, the thesis of the economics of happiness. So whether those were subject matters, for example, like soothing surfaces or hope and risk, or for example, more basic aspects like park life or life with a dog, or, you know, there's some really, really kind of funny stories that exist within the subject matter as well. For example, the fact that in China there was, they found out that, I think it's in Beijing, that old trees encourage happiness within environments. So what they've started to do is to take ancient trees from the countryside or outer regions of the city and bring those into the city and plant them in the middle of like urban areas. So you have these crazy ancient trees amongst like very, very new architecture. So the methodology of the photography, which would then become this like outer layer, was that we would shoot these subject matters almost directly in a kind of reportage aspect, working again with Mathieu Levanchi, the same photographer as Home Economics. But what we would do is crop into those images in a very extreme way, as a means to, in a sense, abstract those images, but also to refer and riff off the way in which advertising tries to bring us excruciatingly close to the content. And this then shows you the kind of campaign, which then worked its way around the whole city, and obviously was disseminated like internationally through digital media and so on, which also became animations, and we're also playing a lot with the techniques that one would usually see in, let's say, the seduction methods of advertising, which are used to increase our sort of sense of you know, let's say, our weakness to this idea of happiness.
One of the kind of key ideas, again, I mean, not dissimilar from home economics. I mean, actually, one thing you may notice, or we've become aware of, is that we tend to recycle ideas quite a lot in our work. But with this project, we wanted to, again, blur the boundary between what is advertising and then what's placed in the exhibition as content. So a lot of these images which are seen outside as posters then become part of the exhibition. It's kind of playing with this language of what is art, what is advertising, and just trying to question that a little.
And then we'll just take you through some images of the exhibition itself. So this narrative principle, I mean, we're obviously like massively condensing the like level of development that goes on to create this kind of work. But what we ended up doing was fusing some of the understandings that we have of how to use material and how to uprate your expectation of what is quote unquote like exhibition graphics. So instead to start to think of this narrative voice as instead a kind of artwork which would exist on all of the walls throughout the exhibition. In order to do that and to create kind of value, let's say, in those words, we created a method where we used very high-level framing, aluminium framing. We used felt inside of the framing, and then we silkscreened the text onto the glass. So you almost felt as though this language had a sort of value which was way more than one might usually expect, to draw you in and to take it seriously.
It's almost, yeah, actually to contrast the ephemeral nature of the museum content. But okay, so yeah, so what a key thing we're trying to do is to kind of frame these texts within something which elevates them, but also taking some of the content. For example, you can see this bookcase. These are documents, happiness documents, which are just filled with very, very extreme, dense data. And so rather than showing all of that data, the idea is just to take the title. They have crazy titles, and you just place the title on a case-bound book and create an installation out of a series of different objects.
In order to create, in a sense, resonance around these like fairly arbitrary pieces of content, or not arbitrary in terms of subject matter, but the fact is you can't display a PDF in an exhibition. So how do you deal with this kind of, how do you deal with the new issue, which is definitely going to emerge more and more, of displaying digital artifacts inside of an exhibition structure? And we worked with various methodologies. So for instance, you can see here new instructions to determine new guidelines for living. These are points which are raised by, for instance, Gallup, which are institutions which are designed and often commissioned by government bodies to say specific data of what makes us happy. Again, the form of this content is really unromantic. Most of the time it exists in Word documents or PDFs. So in order to create resonance is how we did that. You can also start to get a sense of these environments. So using really, really thick carpet in the rooms, like this is like a very thick, almost like a 3 or 4 mil shag carpet, where you almost start to enter into this environment which we feel had a certain resonance which usually only art can have.
The lighting was incredible, actually. It kind of is the kind of lighting when you walk in, the room before and the room after is just never, it just doesn't seem the same. It kind of like transforms your field of the way you see colors. Exactly.
And everything in that exhibition, that particular room was yellow. So a little like within a lot of the projects we make, there's this kind of sense of an overall concept and then a series of specific ideas that all create, it's almost a family of ideas which deal with the subject matter. So rather than deal with, again, reports on the data associated with our happy life, we decided that it would be necessary to create a kind of almost an artist book inside of the exhibition, which started to extract pieces of data. Which
and it's kind of presented as a manual in a very kind of installation, sculptural form.
And as Ollie sort of talked about, there's this sense of like crossing these boundaries between different rooms. So you don't, usually in exhibition structures, you would get these large intro panels when you enter a room. You would have what you call, if you're working with big institutions, for instance, the V&A in London or you know, the Stedelijk, you would have what you call subsection panels. That's like the ordinary way of dealing with it. We were really against any kind of traditional exhibition text, instead using scenography in order to delineate different parts of the thesis of the show. And as you entered the show, these voices became richer and richer. So we started to bring back the imagery, which you saw in the advertising campaign and the general communication that existed around the museum. And we started to use these in a way to create what we called works. Whether they're art or not, we're not sure, but the fact is they have a resonance alike art, i.e. you're drawn to them, you're drawn to take them seriously, and you're drawn to let's say, question what it is that you're reading.
So on to the next.
Yeah, this might feel a little bit like sort of smash and grab, but it's very difficult to show these works ultimately.
So that's what we just showed there is more obviously like physical space and how you deal with that. And this is kind of like a very quick. We're just going to show this quite quickly, a few slides. But this gives you a sense in a very direct way of how we deal with space within the format of a book.
So it's an unusual commission repicture. It's a magazine that's just launched. It comes out of Tokyo. The editor is Akira Takamiya. The question that they gave us was extremely open. We're not sure if this is the way in which other designers are being commissioned at this point, but to us it always feels quite bizarre because we're given an incredible amount of space. So the question was, can you make a magazine curating or bringing together a number of photographers, contemporary photographers, where what we're trying to do and what he wanted to do is to highlight the importance and the power of imagery in an era where we're completely
submerged in imagery through like forms, you know, social media like Instagram, for example.
Exactly. So how do we create a space to give clarity to imagery, and also in order to have a conversation with magazines. In the end, what is a magazine at this point? You know, we've moved through various eras. When we started to design and work with magazines, we were the art directors of Kaleidoscope magazine. We were in the era of the kind of lifestyle magazine. You started to have the Apartmento, Fantastic Man. These magazines started to become almost like books, where often the material object and the quality was far surpassing anything you'd ever seen in a magazine before. But often the content didn't necessarily have the same level of resonance. Then we moved into, with Real Review, we moved into an era which was all about ephemerality and much more presence onto the actual content of the magazine, less the object. And then with Repicture, I suppose the question for us was, how do you create the maximum amount of value? Actually, I'm going to show this first because I feel it would be necessary. When we talk about spaces and the value of space, we really enjoy, and I'm sure a lot of you guys do, enjoy taking a journey to a specific Kunsthalle. In New York, we love to go to Dia Beacon, which is an art space about 2 to 3 hours north of New York. Or the space by Peter Markley in the middle of the Swiss Alps, which is a very beautiful space, which you really have to travel far and go out of your way to visit. Or, for instance, the Kunsthaus Bregenz by Peter Zumthor, where there's a sort of quality of space within the museum, where space has a particular function. So these were kind of, I mean, I could go into detail there, but essentially with the Kunsthaus Bregenz, every other floor is left empty within the museum, but the windows are left unblocked. And the floor between each of the gallery floors, there's a kind of diffused material where the light would come into through those empty floors and create the perfect light conditions for the other floors. So there's always this kind of, let's say, we've been having this conversation for a long time about the kind of quality of space that architects and, let's say, you know, museum directors had noticed that exists around art. So how do you deal with these kind of conditions, whether within a magazine, where the space is the concept? So back to the thing itself. So what we actually did with Repicture was each of the commissions ended up to be 16 pages, and between each of the commissions was 64 blank pages, which were literally drilled with dots, holes, in order to give you a kind of almost breathing space between each of those commissions. I think this was also, in a way, a kind of reflection on like this kind of, let's say, our love of Japan, and especially our love of the kind of printed objects which come out of Japan, where there's this certain kind of, I don't know, cult status that exists around printed objects. And we imagined that with this opportunity, like to work with Akira on a magazine like Repicture, we should take that seriously, and we should create almost an extreme kind of condition in order to give it a kind of cult status.
I mean, it also ties into one of our key beliefs about bookmaking or magazine making, which is is it worth making if it's not an interesting object? Like, we're always interested in like questioning, you know, how a book object can be to suit its content, and yeah, I guess this kind of gives it a very sculptural form, which ties into the way we think about these things.
And the other thing about having the opportunity to work in Japan, as opposed to honestly anywhere else, is that they make things. I mean, maybe Switzerland is the only other exception. Is they make things really, really properly, which is quite amazing to have that opportunity. So these are a couple of images of the production of the magazine. And we made specific films about this object being created in order to use that for the communication, and in a sense part of the identity of the object. We feel like, you know, like it's tremendously important to, like, if you're going to make an object which in a sense has this, you could say, kind of waste of space, if you're thinking about it in a critical way, then one should understand the kind of quality of the object. You need to give it a certain kind of status. And there's all kinds of aspects of how we kind of then started to work with the sense of So repicture essentially means to kind of see a picture again, or to, let's say, relook, or you know, in a way re-examine. It talks about this kind of action, right? Mm-hmm. So we kept thinking about this kind of action of as a means to kind of design all the various aspects of the magazine. So we would look at an image from a page and we would blow it up, and that would then become a poster for the special edition, for example. We would reuse the silk-screened cover, which exists only on the plastic, which shrink wraps the magazine. We would reuse that silkscreen on various elements of merchandise.
On the special edition, the T-shirt, the bag. It's it's kind of an absolute militancy in terms of the way we use one thing.
And this kind of, let's say, this kind of methodology or this kind of concept, which once you're stuck with it or you agree to it, then you really have to take that extreme. You have to think, how do I keep using this? And being the kind of object it is, and being in Japan, they take these conditions like really seriously. So we didn't know we were going to make a magazine about the magazine, exhibition about the magazine, but as the magazine launched, they were like, oh, let's make an exhibition. So we had to consider, how do you make an exhibition about a magazine that you've just designed? So what we did is we reused the plates, the printing plates. So what you're seeing here is the CMYK, so the 4 printing plates which make up each of the printed pages. And these were trimmed and then presented in plexiglass flames inside a gallery called Post, which is in central Tokyo. So this kind of methodology gives us a lot of pleasure, and I think this relates a lot to, conceptual artists, which honestly, the era of conceptual art is kind of backbone of inspiration. And if you take a note from Sol LeWitt, where the idea is the machine that makes the art, I think there's a lot of connection for us in this kind of methodology, where we don't have to think again. Once the idea has been established, it should give you enough agency within the process to almost deliver any aspect of the work.
Okay, so this leads us to, it's the final project, but it's a big project which we split into 2 parts. It's an identity that we've been working on with a fashion brand called Alix, an American brand that's based in Milan in Italy. And we've been working with them for the last 2 years as art directors, and have overseen the creation of the visual identity, manifesto, and pretty much everything that's come after that, including spatial projects, e-commerce, packaging, collaborations with artists, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. So this is one of the first times we're talking about this project. I mean, we're still very much in it, and I think that's something that we're interested to also talk about, is that as designers and running a design studio, you don't really have time to reflect, and in a way, I mean, yes, you have time to literally breathe, but you don't have time to necessarily reflect on the meaning of the work, certainly on a level of, at least, maybe no one does, honestly, but we always feel as though others do, and we don't. Maybe that's your shtick, I don't know. But it's interesting for us to kind of share this from another perspective. In a way, we talk about Alix at this point, at least internally, as a kind of total artwork. Because yes, it is a fashion brand, and yes, it does deliver all of the necessary functions, but it's very, very unusual way of dealing with a brand identity. We also use this term where we sort of ask ourselves the question, which is how to turn attitude into form, which is very, very specific to fashion, we would say. And we talk about this idea of the Gestalt. And the Gestalt kind of comes from a working method or a sort of word which we often use with our friend Voss, the artist, in the works that we make with him. But Gestalt is essentially when something is greater than the sum of its parts. And in a way, a brand and a brand identity and the space of a brand is very much linked to this idea of Gestalt. You could say it's an assembly of components in an ecosystem of constantly shifting relationships. I mean,
so the thing that makes this project different from a lot of the other works that we do, whether it be an exhibition, a book, or any of the other projects, is that really it's so broad in terms of what is being made that to kind of deliver it, well, we have thought of every single aspect, but not just individually, but how they all connect and how you can kind of borrow certain content from one, put it into another. So it's a real ecosystem of content.
And the fact is, it's an incredible risk to take on a project such as this. I mean, it's an incredible level of responsibility, and in the end, we also have to think about our economy. And we have to think about our joy as well, and our sense of freedom within that project. When Matthew Williams came to us, he's the creative director of Elix and the founder, he knew our work. He wanted to, in a way, like, let's say, get, and it's a horrible way of describing it, but get the kind of OKRM, like, full experience, whatever that is. But it's like, how? How do you form this kind of relationship, which is going to be so vast? And one of the ways we do that is to create a kind of common ground. And the way we do that is we spend several days with these characters at the beginning of projects. Like Matthew, he came to London for a few days, and we really go to the very bottom of why this thing is and why it exists. And what we do is, through that work and through that exploration of the beliefs and the ideas and the reason for the project, we create a kind of what we call, well, it is a manifesto.
I mean, the manifesto is a big word, but I mean, it's something which is constantly returned to for a lot of the projects. But essentially what it is, what it provides us with is a predetermined set of rules, which we all agree with. We all have that as a common kind of starting point for anything that we do. And so when we're making proposals for projects or coming up with briefs or defining briefs, as long as it links back to this thing that we've agreed, it kind of fits in.
Anything's possible.
It actually creates, although sometimes it can feel quite strict to create a manifesto, it actually creates a lot of freedom.
Yeah, because you don't have to keep revisiting this kind of sense of concept. In a way, the manifesto contains everything you ever need. The other, let's say, I don't know, tool you could say, but that exists, I guess, within this project, but a lot of our other projects, is the use of dichotomy. So structure and play is a key dichotomy that exists within our work. We often think of an aspect of structure, and by creating a very definitive structure, you're allowed to play, and this is a kind of game.
We always consider that if you have two opposing facts or voices or entities, you're able to understand the whole much better. If you only have one, it's almost, you just miss out so much. But when you have two opposing, you can kind of fill in the gaps. It creates a better balance with the way that something feels and reads.
Exactly. And one of the key dichotomies within Elix and the methodology of Elix, or the idea, the sort of concept of Elix, is this sort of sense of like fact and fiction. So fact, you could say, determines everything that's mechanical, that's direct, that sort of has a universal kind of value, a sort of sense of authority, a sense of consistency. Whereas fiction, as we understand it in our work, is something much more associated with experimentation, with expression, with a sort of open-endedness, and ultimately a kind of story-making and kind of narrative approach. So yeah, no, you go for it. So what this leads to is two very opposing ways of looking at a visual identity. The first here being the kind of fact-based thing, which is everything from the logo to the label to the typeface that's used. Also to a lot of the things that exist within the clothing, like the buckles, the buttons. There's these kind of like stable entities which kind of evolve but generally exist with the brand on a long-term basis. And it provides like a very solid, trustable structure on which you can express other ideas. The fact is with Elix is there's multiple ideas that even exist on this level, and I mean, we decided not to go too deep into those, mainly because a lot of you aren't graphic designers and we don't want to bore you to death.
No, and in many ways we're showing this aspect of the project to make you understand the next bit better. It's this idea that there's the dry and then there's the exceptional, the expressive.
But we did really go to town on this sense of like the factual, to the point where we really wrote a kind of manual for how coding systems worked for every single piece of clothing, for how seasons would be named. We designed a specific typeface. As Ollie mentioned, we designed every single button, zip, pattern, textile that was possible. We will never do that again. I mean, it's not necessary in many ways. I mean, it's great, but it's totally uneconomic. even just to design one button takes an incredible amount of time. I mean, you're talking maybe 10 prototypes for one button.
There was a point in the manifesto which said something like what is it, like something about the detail and the importance of detail, that the kind of like expression of a true concept you can see even in the most minute detail.
Yeah.
So we kind of set ourselves up for,
and we talked about this idea. I mean, this is the problem when you write your own manifesto and then you have to live by it. Sometimes there's a sense of like regret, honestly. I mean, as much as it's kind of great and beautiful and everything, it's just a lot of work. We talked about in cathedrals where these kind of master craftsmen would design the kind of, let's say, the most intricate gargoyles that you often see around Gothic cathedrals, around the kind of, often the tops of the roofs, for example, the parapets. And no one ever sees those gargoyles, you know, you're never next to them. Unless you were to like get a ladder, you just can't see them. But there's a sense that there is this level of detail, gives you a sense of the importance of this church or cathedral. The reason why we showed that, just to say one more thing, the reason why we're showing this is the user manual, but it's also an archive. So every single thing that's made within Alix is also photographed by the same photographer in the same manner. And what we're building is a kind of archive, a live archive of the entire project. And what this means to the element which we're going to show you in a minute, which is the kind of play, is that no one ever questions the structure. Like a lot of brands waste a lot of time in this world. In fact, most brands don't really ever leave this level of the work because they're just spending all of their energy making sure that the logo remains consistent. So actually it's for real purpose. So let's say there's this kind of fact and fiction, and in a way that's a dichotomy, but like Ollie said, there's this kind of whole. So that means there's also the kind of space in between where you start to get the meeting of fact and fiction. So with preparation, which you can see a little bit of here, you have this consistent book object, which we conceptualized, which would be every season. Esther Thaker, who's an incredible young photographer, would work with us to show every single aspect leading up to the collection and the launch of the collection. And each one of these is then made, and the idea is then it becomes also a kind of archive. But just to put it into perspective, this budget that's dedicated to this project used to pay for a kind of lookbook, which was totally disposable. So it's also for us, there's this kind of ongoing pursuit of sustainable and culturally relevant projects within the brand. Also,
just one last thing on that is that just in terms of like our interest, we're interested in having a kind of conversation with fashion history. And one thing that we were very, very inspired by was Jürgen Teller's backstage photography in the 80s or early 90s for Helmut Lang. And that kind of defined the whole genre. So this is us really kind of adding a kind of extra level to that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Same with the invite. I mean, the thing is, when you work in fashion, is you're really treading in the footsteps of kind of giants. You know, like some of the best work, at least from our perspective, is made within fashion. And you know, the fashion invite is like this kind of classic object. I mean, if you look at the kind of amount of beautiful works that are made within the space of an invite, it's kind of an incredible genre. So we take each of those aspects like very seriously within the overall brand identity. And the other thing to sort of say about Alix, which is really important because this takes the pressure off, is that Alix are, how do you say that without saying like hype, but in a way like they're very famous amongst the kind of a particular crowd of like contemporary individuals, whether that's Bella Hadid or Kanye West or Playboy Carti or
Skepta. I mean, they're very So Alix is very affiliated with a lot that's going on in popular culture, and of course with Instagram and the kind of influencer that whole thing. It's not that hard for Alix to communicate what it is they do to an audience. So you know, if Kanye wears a bag, it sells out. It takes the pressure off us. It's not our job to sell clothes. It's not our responsibility. Which means that when we're working with, let's say, art direction concepts, we don't have to think about that. It's not on our mind. We realize that we're never going to be able to like echo the kind of the authority of these individuals. So why not then just not show clothes when you think about the other aspects of communication? In fact, why not make
purely cultural projects in the space of the campaign or in the space of the content. So then there's this kind of the fiction, let's say. So we work the way it's structured is that every season we have a certain amount of budget, and the manifesto and our strategy work, which went into the beginning of the project, allows us to spend this budget however we want, actually. At the moment, we're developing a range of projects, whether that's a piece of industrial design or whether that's a series of sculptures, or whether that's, in this case, we'll tell you about this in a minute, a kind of a work in collaboration with Daniel Shea, who's an artist from New York. It's an incredible amount of freedom, and the reason why that freedom's given is because what fashion needs most, because clothes don't exist in a social vacuum. You know, you could say that they're mobilized and deployed by individuals and groups for specific purposes, and that's the reason why storytelling and fiction are so necessary in fashion, is it allows us a kind of a space to, let's say, create resonance and connections with culture, with today.
This, one of the other manifesto points which kind of led us to this point is that Alix is not just a fashion brand, it's also a cultural platform. So it really enjoys the platform that it's creating through fashion, but it wants to welcome other disciplines in and give them a space to create content or create work.
In many ways, I'm kind of reticent to get into the detail of this particular work because it's kind of a beast. But
skip that now. Well, we could just say a little bit about it.
Yeah.
It's basically, the project's called Ex Nihilo, which means from nothing, or out of nothing. And it is essentially a kind of fictional project created by us and Daniel Shea. Daniel Shea being a photographer who takes on the role of a fictional character who is a sightseer or sociologist. We kind of wrote a script, which you can see here. And this sightseer kind of travels the world. It actually goes through 5 different locations, each which somehow have a connection back to the founder of Alix and his history. And they document the cities and the places. Sometimes it's the landscape or countryside. Other times it's like dense cities. And create a body of work which is questioning and looking at human creativity, this idea of production, whether it be architecture or engineered items in factories and things like that.
And it's a bit of a question, like, how do you do that? Like, how do you, if you have the idea that that's what you want to communicate, how do you do it? So what we did in the case of a methodology is we developed a fictional character who would be let's say we called this character a sightseer, who would be traveling around the world looking at these specific locations. But the position that we eventually took is that the sightseer was, in fact, what we were doing is discovering a kind of archive of material. And by discovering this archive of material, we were able to start to take an objective view on it. This is a hyper simplified sort of slide to show an aspect of that process. You can kind of see Daniel and Ollie working up in the left. There were like many sessions where Daniel would go off on a shoot, let's say in LA or in Berlin or in Ibiza, or where did he shoot? In
Austria.
In Austria, and bring back this material, and then we would start to as if we were discovering this material, try to make sense of it. But at the same time, we were ultimately making a book project, and the book project didn't finish with the layout of that specific book. It actually went all the way to the press. So even within the press, we were still obsessing over this idea of coming from nothing. So we wanted to interrogate the plates on the press and start to work out how to, in a way, let every aspect of the work resonate back to the same idea. And maybe just have a little, sorry.
So this gives you a sense of the book object. I mean, we like the idea that this, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, and the sense that the artwork is a book. That's the kind of like first fact of it. The artwork as book, which has like a fictional framing, it has a narrative, it has photographs, it has tactility and process. It's the kind of making of the work. And then there's other contexts which the work exists in. The artwork exists as an exhibition where the book then becomes the content of that exhibition. And the artwork also exists, we'll show you later, as a prop within a communications program.
And I think the best way of understanding and experiencing this is just to have a look at it, honestly. I mean, we purposely removed all aspects of the explanation of this on the actual object. There's no sense of this fiction, there's no revealing of why it was made or how it was made. So in that sense, it feels strange to describe it to you because we wanted the work to be purposefully discoverable. I think a lot of the reason why, honestly, is because we love to discover things that we have no idea of why they exist. You know, that's often the most seductive proximity you can have to a kind of object, where you become, in a way, the kind of detective, and you start to peel back those layers, and you have to figure out what's going on.
It's also something which, as a publisher, and we're going to show a little bit more about that later, but we're not necessarily interested in books which, on the back, literally describe what it is. It's more about creating like something which is a pure artwork or a pure work. It's really focusing on the content of the book. It's not. Why should that work be explained on it? So when you interact with an artwork in a gallery, and you spend the entire time reading the captions, you're not actually experiencing the installation or the whatever it is you're looking at.
Exactly. Okay, so there's this work. On the other hand, what we're really doing is creating a piece of resource, material. And the important thing about that piece of material, which you could say is art, I don't know whether it's art, it's not for us to say, but the diagram on the right, what it starts to talk about, which is directly pulled from a presentation, is the idea that once you create this thing, then you're able to take perspectives from it. You're able to extract from it. And this is how fashion kind of operates, ultimately. If you go to any fashion studio, they're going to have mood boards full of artists' work, whether that's historical or contemporary. They're going to have material references. It's really all about a very specific kind of research, which is based on mood. So what we're doing by creating this work is actually creating a kind of, let's say, a completely original piece of mood, which can then be extracted back into various levels. So whether that's the level of an exhibition, the level of communication, or indeed the level of like the kind of context, which is what we're describing now, but the context of the thing itself, of how communication functions. So we'll just sort of take you through some of then the ways in which that work starts to be disseminated within contemporary culture and ultimately the brand. So this is an exhibition that we made in Tokyo last April. We were invited as OKRM. We had just finished Ex Nihilo, and it felt really appropriate to show this as a work, as the work. There was no mention of Alix in this case, but at the same time, Alix and Matt were like really, obviously very happy that this work was having this kind of, the work that they had commissioned as having this kind of status. So in a way, we described them as a kind of, I would say, a kind of patron of the work. It's not dissimilar to, from our understanding, the ways in which patrons would commission artists to make specific works. Within the methodology of the exhibition, there was films which were made alongside the specific shoots. The book itself was displayed as an artifact, an object, and the photographs that you sort of see around the walls were actually photographs made by Daniel of the book, which were then offered as specific editions. But also the tests and the works which were made on the press were also part of the show. So in a way, it's a sort of self-made exhibition, which all the ideas were born out of the same conceit. And you can kind of get a closer look at some of these specific works. On another level, when the project and the work enters the space of fashion, it was a bit of a question of how do you do that, you know? One of the key ideas that we were really happy with was the idea of the models in the show, which was also called Ex Nihilo, named after the work, which all gets a bit meta, honestly. But the models walked with the book. And the funny thing about this, in many ways, apart from it just being really great to see a book in a runway show, was that other, let's say, followers of the brand then start to, there's a bit of a trend now of taking books to fashion shows. I don't know whether this is the thing, but it exists, right? If you look at pictures of the shows, the after shows, people take their favorite book to the show. It's true. The work was then extracted and placed within the context of the showrooms, the pop-up stores. The films were showed in various, in fashion you call these kind of activations. At the same time, the invitation was what you see here is a foil block that was made for the special edition of the book. And what you see on the invite is the residue. So the foil, when you foil something, this part is usually thrown away, the silver part, but actually it's a really beautiful thing. So we collected those offcuts, and that became part of the invitation, alongside some of the contact strips from the photography.
Another thing which I guess, you know, you've got Ex Nihilo, which is this kind of, well, it's wrong to call it an independent project, but a project which has its own life outside of the brand. But then also there is this desire to kind of tap into Daniel Shea's, also the commercial side of his practice, where he's also a fashion photographer. So further down the line, like a year after we'd created the original body of work, we created a fashion shoot, which you then kind of juxtapose with these kind of more landscape-orientated photographs to create a series of campaigns, which can then feature in, you know, magazines, various magazines, and street poster campaigns.
I mean, we're super proud of this way of working because ultimately, whether you like the artwork or not, it's really efficient. Like, it's a really efficient way of working because you create this body of work. But it isn't put to waste. It enters a different context of contemporary culture, and then you're able to extract it, and you're able to create the street poster in Paris or the fashion spread. You're able to fulfill these necessities fairly effortlessly.
That's another thing to say, actually, is that if you consider the most fashion is extremely fast, like every season a different campaign, a different story. This is kind of conceived as a slow narrative, so it actually coexisted with the brand for 3 seasons, and every new campaign would be a different iteration of that, so you're kind of adding a piece to the story every time.
And it doesn't really stop there, it kind of keeps going. This is the thing, it becomes this kind of engine. So some of the images that were shot for Ex Nihilo then inspired the designers in the studio, so it became a kind of mood. You could say almost like a mood piece. So the silver high heel actually...
well, yeah, if you look at the image on the left, you can see this is one of the guys that works in the factory creating the buckles, which appear on a lot of the elite's garments. And when they kind of grind these down, there's all these chippings of aluminium which fly. And so basically what we did is we saw that in the image, and then we instructed the factory to collect all of the chippings, and then they would be put into these kind of resin casts, which then become high heels. So there's this kind of dialogue between the narrative and the product, which ends up being released. And
fulfilling the necessity of, like, every season a brand like Alix, but many other brands require graphics. And it's a horrible commission if you're a graphic designer to be commissioned to make graphics, because usually there's no brief, and if it's a brief, it's very loose. Again, this was just a fairly effortless but satisfying repurposing of the material, which was then placed onto T-shirts and created a kind of capsule collection within the Ex Nihilo season. And I think the kind of important, another important aspect of this is that, and we're still trying to figure it out. Like, this is a way of working that we definitely, I guess we can't have invented it, because there must be other ways, must be similar ways that others have worked. I mean, only last night we were talking about Afix, Kiko Konstantinov's brand that has a kind of radio show, and that, you know, it's a kind of, let's say, almost a common kind of cultural project to this. There are other examples, definitely. I mean, Raf Simons has been working a lot with Sterling Ruby over the years, and they've formed a collaboration over a series of collections, and I think it works in a similar kind of way. It's always hard to tell exactly. But the thing that we're really proud of is that we're able to bring this work, we're able to use these contexts, which could be considered usually like commercial projects, but bring them back to our core practice. So Ex Nihilo was published by InOtherWords, and we are responsible, and Alix offer us like that potential to, you know, distribute it, discuss it, as we talked about before, show it in exhibitions, and it enters our space in a way like disconnected from Alix is commercial side of their enterprise, at least to a certain extent. I think it has some connection, but not in a. I mean, it's definitely questionable, and we'll be willing to accept questions on it. But I don't think it's bad. I think this is completely. It's an autonomous project.
It is something we've thought about a lot, which is should art be placed in the kind of realm of the commercial? But actually, what we kind of came to the conclusion was that fashion is just as relevant a platform as a museum is these days. I mean, all of the boundaries are breaking down, and we're interested, and I think a lot of other people are in the kind of discourse of playing with that space and trying to kind of create, like, you know, hybrid forms of practice.
Exactly. And then when we look at, so this is our collection of books with InOtherWords to date, and when we look at that collection of work, we're quite proud in a way, because they connect to so many aspects of our sort of network of friends and collaborators, and they all have a very, very different story behind them, each of these projects. Some are made in a very, very independent context. Some are made, like we talked about, Ex Nihilo in preparation, are made with a fashion brand. Others, for example, the books at the bottom, like Disobedient Bodies and The Journey of Things, are made in collaboration with a large institution. But we're really interested in kind of working out how to create a specific body of work which talks about synthesis, in a sense.
We should also mention the book at the top right of the screen, which is these emerging Czech artists called Linda and Daniela Dostolkova, who sat just there.
And I think that, for us, maybe just brings our conversation to a close. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, we'd be very happy to answer them. If you don't, that's also okay.
Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, with Alix, I was wondering how far you still removed from starting your own fashion brand, or because when I think about fashion and a fashion house, you know, all these aspects are usually, I think, so important, like the invitation, but also the narrative. It's not only about the clothes, and you showed like how much, like from the manifesto and the narrative, how big your influence actually is there. So I was wondering if there are, like, do you see any boundaries still, or yeah, I was wondering about these different roles between the fashion designer and your role, and if there are any.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, the thing is, at this point, with the Virgil Abloh, Matthew Williams, let's say cultural protagonists, which aren't fashion designers, moving into fashion and exploiting the potential space of fashion, we kind of wonder whether that conversation's already been had, you know.
Well, I mean, it's going to continue to be.
I mean, it could continue to be had, but yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, yeah, totally. Yes,
I mean, it
has crossed our mind. It has crossed our mind.
The boundaries are definitely not rigid anymore, and I think we often discuss it as like a lot of the kind of successful up-and-coming fashion brands are those that are run by creative directors who are really, you know, they're just as concerned with the way the brand is communicated as the way the clothes are. Of course, you know, the clothes are super, super important, but they've acknowledged that it's about the audience and about creating community. It's not just about the cut of the cloth, the shape of the garment anymore.
I mean, within our practice, we're really interested in general, and it's becoming more and more. I mean, we're in it now for like roughly 10 years, I would say. And we're definitely really interested to explore like the various potentials on offer already, but also the emerging potentials of kind of contemporary culture and its relationship to communication. Fashion's definitely up there. Publishing's up there. Music, for sure, it's up there. The thing is, it's time, ultimately, is the kind of biggest constraint, and we're already, like, slammed. So when would that happen? I don't know. But it's definitely on the cards, potentially. Well, it's potentially on the cards. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this dense and very rich presentation. I have a strong doubt about your vagueness, and I also have a very strong doubt about the boundaries are not rigid anymore. I mean, you started that slowly, that by mixing up between art and design, and then I started to ask, what is so desirable to be an artist? Maybe it's not as desirable. Later you explained what makes it desirable for you. Then you referred on, went closer, you referred on soluid, you referred on when attitudes become form, and that happens very regular, that especially when designers refer on art, they refer on very old art. When attitude becomes form, is 50 years old. Then, I mean, I really love your collaboration with Alix, and I think it's very interesting what Alix does. But I was asking myself, yes, it's great that Alix takes over things from conceptual art, but it's fashion in the end. And since some years ago, I think it was not a problem to talk about these vague boundaries, but we are now beyond Virgil Abloh. And Virgil Abloh really brought it to the point that he's neoliberal propaganda. He wants to turn art into a narration of creativity. I mean, he's the voice. The interested person are others. And can you promote that? Only to say, okay, I mean, you say we want to squat the social capital, but what is the price that will be paid for that? If we all turn this in this idea of productivity, that is this idea of art's creativity. And shouldn't we keep the boundaries much sharper again?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Interesting kind of remark. Firstly, we're definitely not, like, I would say we're just in flux. You know, we're in the question of it. We haven't, I don't think we've made any claims to any aspect of wanting to be artists, or whether art's more valuable than design, or fashion is indeed a context, or whether it's a genre. You know, it's super complicated. We're definitely involved in a lot of these kind of conversations, like really regularly. I mean, we just worked with Virgil for like 6 months, you know, or even actually more, 9 months, you know, and we were like really involved with him. He's definitely not like, yes, he's the voice, because yes, he's super brave and puts his voice out there. And, you know, he's propelled off the back of Kanye West into this situation. But ultimately, he's you know, he's our generation. So that kind of conversation that he's riffing on is definitely one that we've been part of for like years. You know, this kind of state, what is this, how could you use the power of context like art to get ideas across? We're very different to him, you know. Yeah.
I think just to respond to your comment about attitude as form and Sol LeWitt, I think like, when we refer to those guys, we refer to those exhibitions and those guys is because they've influenced us a lot in the past, and they're ingrained in the way that we think. So when we try to explain some of the decisions that we make, we try to remind ourselves what those are. We create analogy back to art. We don't borrow art or use art. We're informed by it, and it informs our psyche in the same way as it could inform a generation of artists.
But we're also informed by many other things.
To inform a generation of designers and typographers and other types of practitioners.
It's just that when you read paragraphs on conceptual art or notes on conceptual art, I can't remember what it's called by Sol Lewitt, it has a credible amount of relevance, like now, especially as us as designers. I think a lot of the conceptual artists of that era were kind of designers, one could say. They were designing art.
The plan is, design is another word for plan, and those guys were the master planners of
also they were, I mean, take it back to Duchamp. Duchamp was also a kind of master of manipulating context, as far as we understand what we've read. And so it's not like we spend our whole day going, oh, la, 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 conceptual art. It's like, actually, we refer as much to, like, actually all kinds of parts of our contemporary culture as well, but...
No, I mean, and we also talked a bit before, and I also love to look at when attitude becomes form, and sure, I completely understand on Duchamp, but can we separate what, I mean, when I said, I didn't mean he's the voice of Kanye West. I think Kanye West is much more radical than this, but he's the voice of Rem Koolhaas, he's the voice of Hans-Ulrich Obrist, of this cynical, neoliberal people that only have the interest to continue a capitalist narration, who completely dedicate themselves to the survival of capitalism, and we cannot separate. And I mean, he made an alliance with them, and he made himself the voice, the contemporary voice. So this is nothing to cut off. I mean, this is his contract, and so. Since this moment, since this alliance is there, it's not possible anymore to say there are no boundaries between fashion and design and art. They're sharp. Or you say, okay, we go on the Nillerville chain and we go to this nightmare.
No,
there's definitely not no boundaries, but the boundaries are also definitely not sharp. I mean, they're just not anymore. It's not necessarily.
This is neoliberal propaganda. This is the narration of creativity. This is just the narration of capitalism has to go on. It's not true when you say there are no boundaries.
I didn't say there's no boundaries. I said the boundaries aren't sharp anymore.
No, but maybe they should.
They're being challenged for good or for bad. That is just the time we're living in.
The thing is that we're not necessarily interested to dilute the boundaries. In fact, I think we're also interested to sharpen them in other contexts of other parts of our practice. This is the contradiction. And in a way, the tension that we're in, it's a kind of debate, a constant debate about how to...
In that respect, what you say, so when we're working with Daniel Shea, like we on this Ex Nihilo project, we're very careful to create a very clear boundary around that work.
Yeah.
We talked about creating spaces. It's not like we take his work and we just abuse it within commerce.
No,
we
it's
create
not,
a space for it to be it, right? And then it echoes out. So we are also concerned with creating like defined.
I mean, that's
spaces.
the thing when you see the fashion, the models walking around with this book, which is an intact, encased artwork or art object. It doesn't. We don't try and like pin them all over the dress. There's no sort of dissolving. The fact that they were walking with the thing, for us also was a critical move. Because we wanted to show the thing itself, to give it a kind of status as an autonomous status. I don't know whether that's to do with sharpness. I don't know. In the end, I don't think we can accept any, not any, because we're involved in the conversation. But we're not the ones that should draw our own. We shouldn't. At least we try not to be self-critics too much, because if we did go down that path, and there are days that we do, we would not make anything. We would struggle, I think, to make anything. So we're actually trying to use our time and our kind of, let's say, the power that we have and our skills that we have to explore and to create to inflame a certain kind of discourse that hopefully others will be interested to refer to maybe strengthen a argument that might bring a kind of change, you know, or reform.
Thanks. Maybe I would like to add something which might seem a bit more practical about it, but and I would like to somehow connect what Hans Christian mentions just now, and it just, you know, when you were talking, you were very often using words like vast or terminology which was obvious that you need to create content, and therefore this is maybe what I would like to add to what you asked. It's like here is coming the role of graphic designer as a creator, because I can imagine that in many cases, and you also mentioned it during this exhibition, you did this whole scenography and graphic design at CCA, right? This Our Happy Lives, right? So I think that you also mentioned many times this necessity of certain manifestos, that you very often create manifestos which could be called maybe as manuals or sort of like cluster of pre-questions to the commissioner how to somehow investigate what's the content. Is it correct what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly, it is, yeah.
And here I think it's coming this idea of, or is maybe very thin line where graphic designer is very often, in case of art, let's say connections with art institution, where graphic designers are really forced to bring the content, which I think it was, if I understood well, it was mostly, in many cases of commissions you shown us today. Is that right?
It is, yeah.
So somehow I also, I don't know where I'm exactly heading. It's just, I want to say that, you know, this urgency for manifestos, or which is actually the form of this, which is actually coming from art. This is not, you don't call it, it's maybe just the terminology you are using. It's maybe, it could be confusing in the art world. Do you know what I mean? Because when you are, it's very, but it's also confusing in general in graphic design field, because I don't know, last year we attended some Swiss graphic design conference, and almost each graphic designer were showing some sort of manifesto of their work. I was starting questioning if it's maybe a matter of genders. Sorry to mention it, but because I don't recall myself single female graphic designer who were ever expressing herself through manifestos. But I also understand your crazy obsession of to be like of structure. So maybe I don't know. Do you know where I'm heading, Hans Christian? It's something like it's just the terminology is confusing, because we are talking about graphic design in art field, which is always confusing, and it's also confusing because if you are entering, let's say, art institutions, that they are mostly really, they have no clue what is the content very often.
Thing is, the manifesto is not necessarily...
Oh, sorry? I'm not questioning. I'm not questioning. You don't know about it. I'm just trying to figure out where is the. You know, I think that the super thin line in arts and graphic design, because you also said that it's somehow a bit old school to bring this book when attitude becomes form. I completely. It's just this misunderstanding because between these two words. it's just different. It's still about kind of references which are common for graphic design. I don't know if you agree with me, if this book is sort of forming. No. Whatever, I don't want to moderate it. It just, you know what I mean.
Yeah, the word manifesto is has been used and maybe borrowed from art, but you know, you also get political manifestos. Of course, you get artistic manifestos.
You get every kind of manifesto.
Also, the other thing to acknowledge is that words in the British language are constantly evolving their meaning. It's just that's one of the beauties of the British language. Yeah, but maybe it's not accurate to the actual source. When we talk about manifesto in this case, it's more about values and about putting certain stakes in the ground to say this is what we believe in.
But it's not only what we believe in, it's also a device, ultimately, I think. It's a game. Like, this is what we're playing. Structure and play, right? Structures can take many forms. And in certain eras, like in the 60s, structures used to be enough to have a kind of grid system, let's say. But now you need more broad systems, which are going to encompass all kinds of shapes of content and work. So therefore, you need a conceptual grid, you know.
I have just small commentary about that. It's because I really felt the urgency from your part to go to the, most of the time, to go to the core of the concept that who it depends who brings it, if it is curator or client or whatever. But isn't it these boundaries about where the client or curator or an artist will let you go to go through them or to just cross them? Isn't it about that you go to the core as much as the other part let you go?
Yeah, that's our passion for sure. Because we want to be close to, we want to learn. I think it's ultimately an interest in learning from others. And also them to create a kind of synthesis, like a genuine belief in, it may sound cheesy, but a kind of belief in like the potential of humans and creativity and the potential of conversation. You know, like we've been really lucky to get super close to artists' practice and all kinds of people's practice, but you know, like Foss, for example, when we met and started working with Foss, he was in a mess. He's an amazing artist, but he speaks in riddles. He doesn't know how to communicate his ideas. You know, he doesn't, but not only does he want to help work on a book with us, in a way what we do with Foss is we are kind of, in a way, sort of therapists somehow for his work. You know, we try to clarify it, we work to support the work, to his development as an artist. You know, we're close, we're very close in that kind of conversation. We don't always need that kind of proximity, but it's really nice where it's possible. And I don't think that's graphic design. I mean, graphic design, ultimately, you're doing that to make the graphic design problem more interesting. I mean, no one wants to waste their time designing with bad content, you know. So if you have a chance to shape their content, then it's good for graphic design too. But it's not what we spend the majority of our time doing, you know. No, I think we should have a drink and talk more about this kind of stuff.
Thanks for the energy you brought. Thanks.